Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're calling in from today. My name is Julie Kaler, and I am the GAYA Activity Director. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar where we'll be having a dialogue about cross-organizational commitments to gender and youth within the food crisis. Today, we will discuss and prioritize what commitments need to be made to protect gender and youth outcomes in the midst of a worsening food crisis. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Gender and Youth Activity, or GAYA, which is a USAID BHA-funded learning award that works to improve the quality and impact of food security activities by addressing the barriers and challenges implementing partners face when integrating gender and youth within their activities. GAYA is a 5-year award, and we're closing in on the end of our first year. Our team sits across Mercy Corps and Save the Children. The GAYA team worked with colleagues across organizations from Save the Children, Mercy Corps Care, Catholic Relief Services, ACDI VOCA to co-create this session that we have today in order to discuss one of the most pressing issues of our time, the global food crisis, and how this crisis drives and is driven by inequality around gender and youth. During today's call, I will briefly present how compounding crises have and will continue to impact marginalized populations with a focus on women and youth. We will then split into breakout rooms for a rich discussion on the commitments we want to make as implementing organizations in order to prevent further backsliding. Finally, we will collectively discuss actions that will have the biggest impact on critical issues for gender and youth. This will not be an advocacy conversation, but rather a dialogue among implementers of what we are committed to do more of or differently in order to prevent further backsliding for women and youth and build on the amazing bright spots as they persevere through this crisis. Now, to get into today's framing, in the midst of a worsening food crisis, climate change, conflict, as well as over 2 years of COVID-19 changing our world, this is a pivotal moment to reflect on the severe impacts these compounding crises have had on the lives of marginalized populations. We can see from the responses in our chat storm and to our opening questions that you are all seeing these impacts in the work you're doing every day. The international community is mobilizing to find solutions to these compounding crises. Large amounts of funding are available to address the global food crisis, but this funding still will not be enough to meet the world's needs. We know this. It is unlikely also to reach the most marginalized communities, including women and children, unless we, as implementers, commit to designing and adapting our responses more intentionally. If we do not put gender and youth considerations at the forefront of our program design, implementation, and adaptations, we are likely to exacerbate inequalities. Doing so leaves room for new crises and worsening existing ones, not just for women and youth, but for everyone. Articles appear every day on the food crisis. There was an article in The Guardian just the other day advocating for more funding. And while more advocacy is needed for increased funding globally, we have a commitment to the current programming and the current funding available to design and redesign, making sure we pay attention to the disproportionate effects of the crisis based on age and gender at a household and a community level. Today, we want to discuss what the international development sector can do differently in designing and adapting food security programs to integrate gender and youth considerations and prevent further backsliding. Collectively build critical resilience capacities for men, women, boys, and girls in this evolving crisis. Now, first, let's really dive into the realities of the context. The world was already facing a food crisis with the cost of food and inputs on the rise before 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic and the situation in Ukraine have worsened these circumstances. The UN reported that in April 2022, food prices were the highest they've ever been, with 276 million people on the brink of severe food insecurity and an additional 150 million children living in multidimensional poverty. Experts anticipate that in the coming year, food and feed prices could rise up to 20%. The increasing prices of food Pesticides, fertilizers, loss of income, and growing inequality are threatening global food security. In parts of Somalia, we've already seen prices of various fertilizers increase by 75% due to decreased or halted production in Russia and the Ukraine. Without sufficient fertilizer and pesticides, harvests will be significantly smaller. And while many of us are working with farmers and communities to decrease their pesticide use in order to address the effects of climate change, we're still not there in order to take the burden off those communities of what they're relying on for fertilizers and pesticides. For example, data from the Titukulane Arifsa in Malawi, showed that throughout 2022, Malawi experienced significant inflation, affecting markets and the cost of goods, including foods. A cost of the diet analysis used existing national data from April 2021 through March 2022, and it found significant increase in the cost of food items across this time period, with the cost of a nutritious diet based on food habits increasing by 25% over the year. As we know, women and children are often the most vulnerable in the household, and when it comes to not having enough to eat, and when it comes to prioritizing who does eat in the household. So we're seeing this in our programs every day. Looking further at, say, Somalia, which also imports the vast majority of its wheat from Ukraine. Staple goods like cooking oil, beans, rice, sugar have nearly doubled in price. A recent famine risk assessment noted that 81,000 people are already in famine-like conditions, and over 1.7 million are on the brink. Additional projections indicate that 350,000 children are at risk of death. How do you see this appear in your programs? Al-Baraka Rissa in Mali has found that in addition to the compounding shocks of the 4 Cs, COVID-19, climate change, conflict, and cost, the pre-existing multidimensional crisis in Mali, now in its 10th year, threatens the stability and overall well-being of communities and households. The World Bank estimates that a 4.8% increase in the national poverty rate in 2022, with approximately 900,000 people falling back into poverty due to the socioeconomic impact of COVID-19. The August 2021 Mali Gender-Based Violence Information Management System showed a sharp increase of 41% in GBV incidents reported in the prior year. Right? We are seeing the compounding effect based on age and gender of these crises. With these severe impacts across all segments of populations, why is it important to focus on women and youth? This is our question. Well, evidence from COVID-19 and past food crises show us that crises hit women and children especially hard. The COVID-19 pandemic pushed an estimated additional 47 million girls and women into extreme poverty, reversing decades of progress. The current food crisis is embedded within this reality. In 2021, at least 150 million more women than men were food insecure, and this gap is growing. This inequality begins young. Data from Wadata Rifsa in Zinder, Niger shows the prevalence of moderate acute malnutrition at its sites almost doubled in children aged 6 months to 5 years than the rates of the same survey in 2021. If you further disaggregate that data by sex, you see that the rate for girls are 2 times as high as the rates for boys. If you take this inequality of the effects of the worsening food crisis, climate change, and conflict, and over 2 years of COVID-19, what many are calling the 4 Cs again, and add in gender equality, the effect is astounding. We know that by 2021, for every 100 men aged 25 to 34 living in extreme poverty, there are 118 women, a gap that is expected to increase by 2030. So because women and youth are disproportionately affected by these crises, they also must be a part of the solution, right? Women farmers produce 60 to 80% of food in the global South and are responsible for half of the world's food production. In the home, women, especially those in rural areas, are primarily responsible for food selection and preparation, playing a decisive role in their family's dietary diversity and health. Women and youth show incredible resilience capacities and are key stakeholders in agri-food systems. Thus, they are critical partners. They are our critical partners to support sustainable outcomes in response to the global food crisis, right? So it doesn't just disproportionately affect them. They must be our partners in those solutions. Between the rising costs of food and the declining farm outputs, households around the world are struggling to feed themselves. With rising costs and a lack of access to labor-saving technologies, women and youth are doing most of the labor-intensive manual farm work. With declining agricultural outputs, women, who are responsible for 75% of unpaid work worldwide, are now working even more for even less money. Unequal power dynamics and patriarchal traditions mean when there is not enough food to go around, women and children do eat less. This leads to malnutrition, stunting, and low birth weights. Across Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia, 5.7 million children are expected to become acutely malnourished in 2022, of which more than 1.7 million could be severely acutely malnourished. And it does matter if you are a little boy or a little girl, how that is affecting you. Spikes in food prices have particularly negative repercussions for female heads of household. Women often suffer labor market discrimination, which confines them to informal employment, as well as pay inequality. Also, compared to male heads of household, they frequently spend a bigger share of their earnings on food, which is beneficial for food security, but reduces funds available to cover other needs. Rising fuel prices limit women's already reduced access to agricultural markets, and it makes it more difficult for women to run small businesses. And it means that women spend more time taking children to school, gathering firewood, getting to markets and jobs. If we look at the Spices program in Madagascar, at their most recent youth event, the impact of the food crisis was really coming through. Low ag productions means lower income for those youth who do rely on farming. So this means that youth look for alternatives, which are often limited as well. The youth said they were taking on other low-paid daily labor because of no other options, and limited income within agricultural production was on the decline. Youth working on entrepreneurship and income-generating activities said it was becoming more difficult to do those activities because their potential customers were also struggling and did not have money to purchase things offered by these small business ventures. So youth are really trying, youth are engaged, and still they are struggling within this current crisis. Now, crises also make women and girls less safe. It's harder and more expensive to access services like school, medical care, and agricultural education programs. COVID-19 exacerbated gender-based violence and limited women and girls' access to safe spaces and services in many places that we all live and work. Education suffers as well. Hunger deprives children of the energy they need to walk to school and from school, and those who are able to be in school can lack focus. In some instances, their families migrate to search for food, causing children to miss out or drop out of school. An evaluation that reviewed 3 RIFSAs in Niger between April and May of 2021 saw that most men and women noted that their families made the decision that they would get married. This was particularly prevalent in the Gurma study area, where nearly 90% of women in the intervention group noted that their families made the decision for them to marry, right? So this is pushing marriage for girls at younger ages. In the Wadata study, groups with over 70% of respondents noted that their neighbors thought girls should marry as soon as they reach puberty. So this is not just happening at a household level, this is happening at a community level. Girls who missed school due to COVID-19 are also less likely to return to school than boys, putting their reproductive health, job opportunities, and well-being for themselves and their children at risk. When resources are scarce, older girls are more likely to be married off or pulled out of school to work at home, while boys feel pressured to find work, such as shining shoes or washing cars. Furthermore, we see that when households struggle with acute hunger, gender-based violence soars, and men and adolescents bear the brunt of risky coping strategies such as migration that can undermine progress towards long-term food security. The implications of inaction are grim for the livelihoods and health of all people, right? Not just women and youth, but especially for women and youth. However, there's evidence to show that progress for women and youth has and continues to be made, even in the face of this evolving crisis. And so we cannot forget the bright spots. A study of the SHE program implemented by CARE in Sierra Leone shows that strengthening linkages of farmers, largely women, to financial services such as VSLAs, and making them less dependent on fossil fuels for their business operations through the use of solar power and renewable energy, makes women and households more resilient to the effects of the global food crisis and the rising cost of living. Investing in equality means investing in food security. Let me just say that again. Investing in equality means investing in food security. Ensuring that programs consider the different needs of women and youth adds time and complexity to the implementation. Yet, data analysis illustrates that the lower gender inequality is, the greater food security is. Let me say that again. Data analysis illustrates that the lower gender inequality is, the greater food security is. So we know that we must intentionally address the needs of women and youth to build resilient food security. The question is, what steps can we take in the international development sector to make this happen? We want to hear in this conversation what commitments you want to see from all of our organizations and all of us as implementers to protect and improve the progress we see, to prevent further backsliding for women and youth, and transform the drivers of the specific vulnerabilities that women and youth face through our responses to the global food crisis. Again, this is not an advocacy conversation. This is a conversation amongst implementers who are committed to specifically addressing the vulnerabilities of women and youth within the ongoing global food crisis.